Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the planet at this particular moment. It's great to be back. This is our day three of our third annual seminar in the Eastern Mediterranean, the George E. Danis Seminar on Security and Diplomacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this year we are focusing on the whole notion of resurgent, which we put in quotations on Monday after the presentations on Monday, of resurgent nationalism in the dynamic region of the Eastern Mediterranean. And for some of you who have been attending and listening to our first five panels on Monday and Tuesday, we began by a process of sort of like, formulating the idea of nationalism and bringing it back with Professor Milonas and Professor Prodromou on Monday, and really infusing it with the notions of religion and identity in some way, shape, or form, and how that's changing the geopolitical framing of the part of the world that we define as the Eastern Mediterranean. And yesterday we sort of like leaped into the region by three wonderful panel presentations, starting out with early in the day with Ms. Prokopiou and her analysis on the conundrum, the Cypriot conundrum, and the geopolitical conundrum that Cyprus is in within this framework, and raising the question as far as whether it's possible to have some kind of a solution, or this is the status quo solution that the location of the island of Cyprus finds itself in. And we moved on to looking at Turkish foreign policy with Professor Giaras, and looking at the Turkish foreign policy from looking at it from Ankara and spreading out from Central Asia all the way to the Balkans, and of course in mind with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia right now in the Black Sea area. And the third panel yesterday was with Dr. Aykan Erdemir, and he sort of like looked at the possibilities of how the 3+1 spillovers into the possibility of changing Turkish foreign policy in some kind of a collaborative manner. So as we're moving forth today, we're very excited to have three wonderful panels today, starting out with two very good friends and colleagues who have been very gracious with their time, and looking at this international organizations and interaction in the region of the Eastern Mediterranean. And I was joking around before we started about our unsung hero here, and this is Professor Dimitris Tsarouhas, who has been a wonderful friend, and I think I've known him for close to a decade now. And he's our unsung hero because he's willing to do this at 8 a.m. Eastern time. Dimitris, is a visiting associate professor at Virginia Tech and associate professor at Bill Kent University. He's a senior research fellow at LEMEP. And this is just a small little drop of what his credentials and background is. We could be spending the next 90 minutes just outlining his credentials, and our other panelists who should be, it's very difficult who gets top billing here, but Ms. Afentouli is the executive director of the Institute of International Relations at Danis, who is also a partner in this seminar this year and last year, and she has spent over 20 years at NATO in Brussels, responsible for the communication area of the southeastern Europe and Mediterranean. So a great expert in what's going on in the region and the prospects of the region, and sort of like the interaction of these two organizations, one in the EU, the other one of NATO in the region itself. So without further sort of like my blabbing on about this, I do want to turn it over to Dimitri, and who will speak on the EU and the Eastern Mediterranean challenges and opportunities. Hearty welcome to both of you, and very much looking forward to your presentations. So Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Petro, thank you very much indeed for this very kind presentation. Good morning to everyone. Good afternoon on the other side of the Atlantic. I am very, very pleased and honored to be invited again by my good friend Petros Vamvakas to the George Danis Diplomacy and Security Seminars. It's always a pleasure to be part of this and to try and sort of interact with students and colleagues. And it's especially important for me this year, not only because it's very early on this side of the Atlantic, as Petros said, so I'm trying to gear up here, but also because I'm joined in our panel by Afentouli, and I think that her expertise is going to be especially important as we try to sort of navigate the choppy waters of the Eastern Mediterranean and trying to make at least some sort of suggestions about where we are at the moment and where we can go from here. I think that we have shared screen capacity, and I have a presentation. I'll try to keep the presentation short, but I will try to sort of load this for you now so that you can follow what I will be talking about in this way. I hope it is visible to you. Is the presentation visible now?
Yes, all set.
Excellent. Okay. So as Professor Vamvakas mentioned, I will be talking about the role of the European Union in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is, of course, going to be underpinned by both the sort of challenges that the Union faces in this rather difficult neighborhood, this difficult geopolitical, geostrategic, cultural, and economic area. And I will try to place this in the context of the changes that have been taking place quite dramatically over the last couple of decades, especially as a result of hydrocarbons exploration, and of course the political calculations behind this, both by EU members and of course by non-EU members. So the East Med project in particular will take some of our time as we try to sort out the ways in which new alliance building has become possible as a result, particularly of natural gas explorations, but also what the challenges of further cooperation are. And there, as you can see on the one but last bullet point of this slide, the role, the activism, the revisionism, the foreign policy orientation of Turkey becomes very important as it becomes the country that is really the elephant in the room in terms of not participating in the sort of cooperative actions that have been taking place over the last couple of decades, and yet whose presence or absence indeed is going to shape the way in which the Eastern Mediterranean will look like, both from a security point of view and also from a political economy point of view going forward. And that, of course, would include the Cyprus issue, but it goes way beyond Cyprus. It also includes the bilateral disputes that Ankara has with Athens, especially, and so on and so forth. So let me set this a little bit into context in terms of our international or regional organization for this morning, the European Union. Let me begin by making a slightly provocative statement, which is that the European Union hardly has a presence in an area which over the last 20 years in particular has risen massively in geopolitical importance. And whilst it is true that it is being currently overshadowed by events taking place a bit further north and to the east, especially with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war, it is undoubtedly true that the Eastern Mediterranean as a point of contestation among middle and great powers going forward will be massive. In that sense, the fact that the European Union is absent or largely absent from the region's geopolitical calculations constitutes a major problem in its attempt to try and match its economic power, which remains massive, with its political influence, which remains subpar. Where does the European Union depend in the region? Essentially, it depends, obviously, on the actions and interests of its member states, the ones located directly in the region, such as Greece and the Republic of Cyprus. It is also influenced, of course, by those that have a geopolitical stake in making sure that the direction of travel in the Eastern Mediterranean aligns with their national interest. And I'm thinking especially of France here, whose alliance with Greece has been upgraded over the last 5 years in particular. And it also relies on other major players who try to mediate between belligerent or disputing, let's say, powers in the region whenever this aligns with its own trade and energy-related needs. And that's, of course, the Federal Republic of Germany. The reason why the EU, however, as an institution, the reason why the absence of the EU matters has to do with two important factors, I think. It is a real policy problem in the sense that the European Union wants to upgrade its role, and it realizes, as war knocks on its door in Europe again, about 30 years after the massacres in former Yugoslavia, that its declared intention of assuming some type of strategic autonomy, which is the big France-backed project in this region and indeed beyond it, is automatically undermined by its lack of activism. At the same time, that muted presence that I mentioned is also creating a hole and a gap in a rather contested policy space, which has been created, I think, in this region by the rather silent withdrawal of the United States, or at least the reinterpretation of its role in the region. And, of course, importantly, the desire by revisionist powers further to the east to fill this gap and to become the new protagonists in this rather contested policy space. So that absence of the EU, therefore, has important geopolitical consequences. And it's not only to be interpreted, I think, as the lack of institutional initiative taking by the European Union. Now, why has the East Med become so important? I think in a nutshell, we all know that the discovery of hydrocarbons in the region since the early 2000s has been the most important factor. And of course, what this has unleashed over the last 2 decades, and I think that our seminar is really part of the same large debate, has been this discussion as to what this actually means going forward in terms of alliance building, cooperation between states on the one hand, or the creation or rival blocs on the other, the creation of divisions among states participating, for instance, in the EU or not, in NATO or not, and so on and so forth. And so in that sense, therefore, highlighting the role of particular countries and particular actors is rather important. I want to do this. I will do it more detail later on with regard to Turkey. But let me just say here, following on from yesterday's seminars, that Turkey constitutes a typical example of the ways in which that lack of activism by the European Union interacts with the rather revisionist agenda that certain states have brought up. If you consider Turkey, it's an interesting case study of an interacting country. What I mean by this is it's a very large and influential state. It's an extremely important state in the Eastern Mediterranean, which cannot be and should not be overlooked by any of the major actors. It's at least formally a candidate for membership in the European Union. And of course, it is a NATO member. Its activism in the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly over the last 5 to 6 years, particularly through the decision that Ankara seems to have taken to go down a unilateral policy route of seesaw explorations off the coast of the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus, in the Aegean Sea, doubting fundamental Greek, that is to say, a fellow NATO allies' interest in the region, has been obviously, as I mentioned before, contested by France and has been doubted by the vast majority of the international community. But he has also been more awkwardly and silently received by Germany. Of course, France and Germany constituting the core EU member states ever since the formation of the Union, and to this day becoming key players in the Eastern Med and far beyond. And so the fact that they are positioning themselves, or at least they appear to be positioning themselves in rather different ways when it comes to a key actor in the Eastern Med, suggests, I think, and reinforces the earlier point, about the difficulties that the EU has to play a clear, coherent, and strategically minded role in the region. I don't want to go into too much detail as to the discovery of hydrocarbons that you see on this slide here. I just want to point out a few of the most important sort of discoveries that have been made in recent years, and you can see them on the slide. And also, of course, suggest that some of those findings in some of those geographic areas are, of course, much bigger than others, with countries such as Egypt through the Zohr discovery in 2015, Israel, of course, Leviathan, and Cyprus playing a potentially important role going forward. The discoveries that have been made over the last few years have led to drilling activities, they've led to seismic surveys, and this, of course, has interacted with the exclusive economic zones, the EEZ rights that you see there, among states. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that in the Eastern Med, not only do you now have strategic calculations as to those discoveries and the economic rents that are to be derived from their discovery, you also have, of course, the very big problem, which interacts with those discoveries, that is that the exclusive economic zone delineations between states, part of how international law should be applied in this region and across the world, has yet to be made. And so in a situation where you've got A, discoveries, B, drilling activities, and C, non-delineation of economic zone rights, you have the potential of conflict, particularly when certain states adopt a rather revisionist understanding of what things such as good neighborly relations is constituted by. In that sense, and the final ingredient that has made the Eastern Med a bit of a powder keg over the last few years is the fact that you have open disputes in the region. And without mentioning the Middle Eastern disputes, which is far from my own area of expertise, I will refer obviously to the Cyprus problem, an open wound at the heart of Europe really since 1974, Greek-Turkish relations, which have been quite contested over the last few years, and of course the dispute between Cyprus and Turkey as well. So in that context, what about the East Med? Let me just say a couple of words about the East Med and why that constituted or appeared to be constituting an opportunity for the region and why it is a challenge. So the East Med project is essentially a project of hundreds upon hundreds of miles of pipelines that would transfer some of those discoveries we saw before, particularly the gas discovered in the Leviathan and Aphrodite areas, to Europe via EU member states, Greece and Italy. And it's important to note that despite the fact that by now the project has largely been declared non-viable for reasons that relate to the green transition by the United States, the blessing of the European Union and the European Commission in particular, which designated it a project of commercial importance and therefore tried to encourage it, was actually an important factor behind its upgrade. The project has been funded by the European Union, the engineering and the design, partly funded by the EU, and in that sense, it has received the backing of the European Union. As I say, not the case any longer with the United States. The offshore segment of the East Med pipeline, or series of pipelines, passes through the Israeli, the Greek, and the Cypriot exclusive economic zone. And that has been the constituent factor behind the decision by the three countries, in addition to the United States, of building what appears to me to be a long-term alliance, premised obviously on the interest that united the three countries with regard to the transfer of hydrocarbons and the economic rents that are to be associated with it. But this also has, of course, political consequences in terms of alliance building. A very concrete expression of that has been the formation of a new international organization. Since 2019, we have the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which has been set up by the three countries, Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, in addition to Egypt as well. We saw the Zohr discovery earlier being the biggest in the Eastern Med. The charter of the gas forum was signed in 2020. Regular meetings are taking place between the countries that are participants. And who are these countries? It is important to keep in mind that apart from the three and Egypt, you also have Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, as participating in the new forum. And you also have European Union members who are not part of the region, in the form of France and to a lesser extent Italy as well, in addition to the United States and the World Bank as observers to it. Again, the big name that looms large here is Turkey, the absence of which is premised on the idea that the entity that only Turkey recognizes, the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, is obviously not a member of this, that the maritime rights of Northern Cyprus are being violated as a result of this agreement, etc., etc. And it's important to keep in mind here, given where the balance of power in the Eastern Med lies, that countries such as Egypt are not entirely happy with the way in which the project has been set out in terms of transferring gas to Europe either. So Egypt has proposed an alternative route. And it is true that the Eastern Med now appears to be less of an immediate project for Europe, because in 2022, last year, Europe imported 5 billions of gas in the form of liquefied natural gas, what we call LNG, from Egypt and Israel. Now, this didn't cover a large part of its needs, only 1%, but it's important to register that transfer of LNG gas, because it's a clear sign of a vote of approval, so to speak, by the European Union, both of LNG facilities, which are plentiful in some countries in the region. Greece is playing here an increasingly upgraded role through its LNG terminal in the north of the country, in Alexandroupolis, but also, of course, the willingness of countries such as Egypt and Israel to be here, not only an intermediary in the process, but actually export gas directly. The East Med suffers from problems, however, and I think it is worth mentioning those as well. You can see them. I don't have too much time to get into all the details, and I'll be happy to answer questions later on. But there are important issues outstanding on the East Med, both with regard to the political viability of the project, in the absence of key actors such as Turkey and others. The commercial viability of the project, because fundamentally will be a market decision, regardless of political calculation, whether the project will come to fruition at the end. And that's especially important in light of US withdrawal of its support. It's also questionable whether it does allow for the disentanglement, the de-alignment, if you like, of the gas dependence that Europe has suffered from in the hands of Russia for too long. Does the project do enough for Europe to acquire its autonomy from Russian gas? Questions remain. And it's also important to ask whether the East Med is indeed the sort of technology of the future that Europe has prided itself in pushing forward, particularly as an economic actor. You may know that Europe has been setting very ambitious targets in terms of what it calls the green transition. And it has been funding that transition to the tune of billions of euros over the last couple of years. The idea of an electricity grid connection between Africa and Europe through undersea cables, in which, again, countries like Greece and Cyprus will come to play a key role, particularly in the form of the Euro-Asia interconnector, now appear to be an alternative to the East Med project. And finally, of course, from a political point of view and from a security point of view, what are the real consequences of the East Med in terms of the return of what I would call hard alliances in a rather unstable and volatile region? Could the emergence of this sort of middle power rivalry underpinned by great power sponsoring exacerbate underlying tensions and therefore make the EU's role even less significant as we go forward? Since you've already had a lecture on Turkey, I don't want to dwell too long on this. I've already taken too much of our time, but I will underline, as I come closer to a conclusion, the role of Turkey here. Because the role of Turkey does, I think, or at least in my mind, underline some of the big dilemmas that the European Union as an actor is facing in the Eastern Med. The European Union has confronted the role that Turkey has attempted to play largely with consternation, and it has been worried and rightly worried about Turkey's activism in the Eastern Med. But the fundamental fact remains, and that is that the incapacity of the EU to act as a geostrategic and political actor elevates the role of individual member states, and the extent to which they can travel the road that the EU would like them to is, of course, questionable. Now, it is true that Turkey has started to amend some of its foreign policy priorities in recent times. Some of the inconclusive moves made earlier have proven to be essentially not very much worth. And so an attempt to reset relations with countries in the region, especially with countries such as Egypt and Israel, I think has been largely welcomed as an attempt to overcome some of the underlying tensions. At the same time, there has also been the formation of a new set of alliance within the European Union, and I'm referring in particular to the Franco-Greek alliance, manifested both politically and militarily in recent years. This alliance has been an important check on some of Turkey's ambitions in the region. It has underlined the fact that a major European power such as France is ready to play an active role in the Eastern Med and to check some of the revisionist plans of Ankara. And maybe this will provide, going forward, the sort of spark that will allow for fresh thinking, particularly on the side of Ankara here, away from a rather zero-sum activism that created largely unnecessary tension between NATO allies such as Turkey and Greece, and eventually lead to a more comprehensive approach in order to resolve outstanding bilateral problems, and also make a very important country like Turkey part of the solution and not part of the problem in the wider region. So just to conclude and to recap this presentation, the European Union has largely been absent from the region. Its geostrategic absence has been noted, but it now realizes, I think, that this absence comes at a cost, and the backing of the East Med project by the European Commission, the increased activism of some of its members, suggests that it wants to play a more important role in the region. It is important to underline that the formation of the gas forum as a new IO can potentially act as a cooperation multiplier in the region, and it will do so, I think, only to the extent that it doesn't suffer from some illusory projections about the capacity of the gas forum to change the dependence of Europe on Russia, or indeed overestimates available reserves. Even so, problems will persist, and they have to do with things such as the European Union's alternative climate change ambitions that should not be treating natural gas as a green-friendly resource, the commercial viability of its projects, and of course, continuing geopolitical tensions with actors like Turkey, the future direction of which, at this very crucial juncture in which the country finds itself, will tell us many, many things, not only about where the country itself is going, but about wider developments in the region more generally. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
No, thank you. I mean, a lot to unpack there, and you know, it's really like, you know, yesterday there was an introduction of this notion of love versus interest when it came to like Turkey and the Balkans, and I love this sort of like, you know, juxtaposition that some of the things you say, which sound good, but there are underlying interest there, and I really like the presentation. There's a lot to talk about, and turning over to you know, somebody that knows the region very, very well, and you know, we're very honored to have her here as I said, as a partner in this whole undertaking, and also to have her presence here. You know, I concur with Dimitri that having you know here is tremendous, and I can't wait to hear her take and on what's going on in the region, even from a NATO perspective. So, you know, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Petros and Dimitri. I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon for us in Athens. But I'm very happy that the Eastern Mediterranean Danis seminar takes place and takes such an important place in the discussions about this area, which are not very frequent, I would say, despite the fact that this is a region that affects the stability and security of the whole Europe. So, and I'm glad that my good friend Dimitris Tsarouhas is with me at the panel, and even more happy because we are not going to overlap. he made an excellent presentation, very comprehensive, on the EU's role in the area, and I will follow up with NATO's presence. But before doing that, I think we have to put in the equation some key points of the changing geopolitics of the region because of the war in Ukraine. The two are not decoupled. Also because both institutions, the European Union and NATO, are very much absorbed since February last year by what is happening in Ukraine. And they have not, for the time being at least, they have not the capacity to deal with two fronts at the same time. Maybe it is strange to characterize the Eastern Mediterranean as a front, but because it's a strategic area for both the European Union and NATO, we should think about the institutionalization of the relations of the countries of the region with both institutions. And I think this is the missing link to follow up on where Dimitris stopped his presentation. This is, if I may say so, based on my experience. I'm not anymore with NATO, but still, I mean, the lessons I learned from NATO, I think, is always useful for our discussion. Up to last year, before the blatant, the so brutal, let's say, invasion of Russia to Ukraine, both NATO and EU had a very efficient tool for bringing peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. This tool was enlargement. So consecutive enlargements made easier the coexistence of nations that have differences. And this is the logic behind also the EU-Turkish relations. Now, the big questions for you scholars and us practitioners is if this tool can be of use in other areas. If it can be of use in the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, or if we need other tools that can not substitute the enlargement, but still, if we have to be realists and say, no, enlargement is not going anywhere anymore beyond the frontiers of EU and NATO, and we have to think about other mechanisms, other tools that can bring countries that we need for our stability and security together without being full members. And this applies for Turkey, and this also applies for Ukraine. In a way, first of all, we don't know how Ukrainian war will end. Let's hope that it will end to the benefit of Ukrainians' sovereignty. But reading the analysis and following, I mean, the discussion about Ukraine, you can see that most of the countries, US including, would like to see a solution that would not be to the 100% isolation of Russia, because this will be even more dangerous after the end of the war. it will be, I mean, to use a historical precedent, it will be like the isolation of Germany between the two wars. I'm sorry to say that so blatantly, but this is my perception. So we have to find institutional mechanisms that accommodate the countries at the Eastern Front after the war. For Ukraine, I would say integrating to EU is one very good solution for securing the frontiers of the country, even with territorial losses. Forgive me that I am so outspoken here, but I'm trying to be realist. So once the Ukrainian front is managed in a way, and I don't see this happening very close, I believe that Russians will prolong to take whatever they can take, and also to influence the US election that year in a way. So this is one thing. When we come to Eastern Mediterranean, maybe our participants can say that these areas are not connected. I believe to the contrary that they are connected, because before the war in Ukraine, Russia had a very active role in Syria and in Libya. So they made clear that they would like to be in the Mediterranean, as historically it has been always the case. And if we consider the Black Sea as a very important strategic theater for the relations of the West with Russia, Black Sea is connected to the Mediterranean through Turkey. So Turkey's role will also be important after the end of the war. Now, coming to the main Mediterranean area, there you have countries institutionally bound with the West, NATO members, Greece, Turkey, Balkan countries, Italy, and so on. You have EU members as well. You have a very active and growing cooperation between EU and NATO, but you have also the problems that we all know deriving from the institutional imbalance because of the different memberships of the countries of the region. Turkey is a member of NATO, but not a member of EU. Israel is a very important country for the region, not a member of NATO, neither of EU. Equally, Egypt, a very important country of the region, non-member of NATO, non-member of the EU. They are all tied by partnership schemes, but this does not mean that all countries are tied with the same links with the West, the political West. So what I see as a vacuum here is an institutional framework that can bridge the needs of the EU and NATO members with non-EU and NATO members. Because if we admit that the region is important for our security and stability, and I think at this panel at least we are persuaded that this is the case, we need also to tie this region with institutional ties. And this is an institutional vacuum now that we have, because, I mean, both EU and NATO was in the previous decades were focused to absorb the vacuum created by the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so they left this area practically untied with the problems that are very well known. So we need such a good, let's say, creative diplomacy to invent such a framework. It will not be easy, but it will be very useful. And what Dimitris described about the energy resources, I think comes as a priority for US especially. Why? Because even if the war ends whatever the outcome, the relations of the West with Russia would not be ideal. I don't foresee that in the very near future we will have very good relations with Russia, because Russia, especially if they consider themselves defeated, they will try to take revenge. So we need to care about Russia, both at the Eastern Front and at the Southern Front. So for the US, it's becoming very important to have Europe distanciated from Russia on the energy field. It's even more important than before for strategic reasons. So the US, that may I remind you, 1 year ago stated, the US Department, that, okay, we prefer to have renewable energy resources in the Mediterranean than having exploration and the gas and so on. Now they are turning back in the region saying, yes, you have to explore and discover as much as possible. And you have to try to build a coalition of the countries involved, interest, producers and countries of transit, to have as fast as possible a new source of energy in the Mediterranean and for Europe. So to get rid, let's say, of dependence of Russia and produce energy from other sources. So this is an opportunity for the region also to build a framework of maybe not of a solution of the existing problems, but of bypassing the problems by offering a win-win, let's say, way forward. I'm not saying maybe somebody, especially somebody from the nationalist front, as the title of your conference is, was listening to me, may comment that this is impossible, that we have first to tackle the issues of sovereignty, of solution of the Cyprus problem, and so on, and then to discuss how we cooperate to bring out the energy resources. But it seems now that the advice, especially coming from Washington, to both, at least Greece and Cyprus, that I know, because I cannot speak for the other countries, is that you have to try to find a way to cooperate with other countries like Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, and also Turkey, of course. I mean, to have an understanding how these resources can be exploited. It is a strategic game. So it is an opportunity. I mean, in my view, it is an opportunity. It has disadvantages, certainly. Some disadvantages you may have. Always in a compromising solution, you have advantages and disadvantages. The essential thing is to have something to provide positive in regards to the negative aspects. And we are not talking about, heavy agreements, legally binding and so on. We are talking about exploration and exploitation. And there, we have to pay attention at what Israel is doing and saying, especially also with the Abraham Accords group of countries. Because there you see, and I may conclude, with this remark, because I would like, to listen your views. You have an alliance of Gulf countries, also producers of energy resources, with Mediterranean countries. Though you have to admit that this is a very interesting and unusual marriage, let's say, bringing together the Gulf and the Mediterranean. But it may work, finally, as a status quo solution, because it will be against powers like Iran that are against the status quo in the Mediterranean, and they are trying to influence what is happening in our region. So this is, I mean, the points I would like to make, and I would be happy, I mean, to further discuss it, because maybe, as I said, I put these ideas on trial, let's say, here, and thank you for offering me the opportunity.
Thank you. And, you know, I think it's, thank you to both, you know, very thought-provoking points made on both ends. And I think it's, you know, if I may, I mean, I think that's what the ideal here is, to like sort of like put this things on the table and have like an open discussion. One of the lamentations that we all have, I think, is that how our information is so, like, you know, couched these days, that we don't necessarily put anything on the table that might be even challenging our thought process. And I thank you both for doing that this morning. I certainly have a lot of like thoughts and questions on this, and, you know, and I can, you know, can start from the last point that you made, you know, and then work backwards, and then like give the opportunity for others to sort of like, you know, have a discussion. But, you know, I couldn't agree more in this sort of like, you know, recasting the region and outside of the box and looking at this interest-based structures. And, you know, I also liked your point as far as this region that's not necessarily institutionally tied. And I think one of the main goals of even like the Institute here is to, you know, when we talk about the Eastern Mediterranean and not necessarily North Africa or Levant or Middle East, but to recast it in the Eastern Mediterranean speaks to so how do we reformat that? And when you were speaking of that, I was thinking of the Amos Hochstein agreement that was brokered for Lebanon and Israel fairly recently, that sort of like, you know, bypasses nationalistic, you know, objections as far as, you know, even recognition of state, you know, between Lebanon and Israel. And here you have like, you know, this sort of like, you know, working out an interest-based agreement between two entities directly with the U.S. So you have this sort of like, you know, at the time that, you know, going back to Dimitris' point, at the time that you think that the U.S. is receding from the area, I think we're seeing the United States more involved in the area in a completely different facet. So we sort of like have like a completely different structuring. Even the things that we noticed before are very different. And, you know, when you talk about the Abraham Accords, you know, the person that sort of like puts this forth at the end of his tenure is Donald Trump. So he is like this extraordinary character outside of, you know, the framing of this kind of like, you know, academic or policy making structure, and says, okay, let's make a deal. You know, let's just like, you know, throw up the deck of cards and see what lands and see where we are. And I think, you know, that's what I think I'm picking up on what you're saying. And, you know, this is the time to really think outside of the proverbial box in some way. And, you know, if I'm hearing that right, and to Dimitris's point about the EU, the absence of the EU, very, very interesting kind of like, you know, observation as far as the absence of the EU, although the EU seems to be present, the France and Germany and even the, you know, are present, but the EU is absent, right? So this sort of like, you know, a nationalistic or national imperatives might be there, and we see it happening, whether it's like, you know, energy, or we see it with, you know, weapon recurrence, you know, like, you know, you have like, you know, very good clients in the region that go out to, you know, EU members, but not the EU. So the Italians, the Spanish, the French, the Germans are all like, you know, have like interests there that are commercial interests, but not necessarily the EU. So there's that kind of a structure that's taking place. And of course, the big boogeyman is, you know, and I like Ino's point about this, you know, which is sort of like honest, coming from somebody who has been there, to say that, you know, how the war ends is uncertain, which is sort of like, you know, really like a very honest and brave thing to say at this particular time, like one year later. So those are my comments. I don't know if I have a question in there, but those are my thoughts and comments. So, given the opportunity to both of you to comment, and then, like I said, there's also a question in there, so we can keep the conversation going. I'm more interested in that. So, I don't know if Dimitri, you want to go first, and then the way that we presented this. So.
Can I, Pedro, very briefly just make
Yeah. The floor is yours, Dimitri. Go ahead.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment very briefly on Ino's excellent set of points, very thought-provoking, and it really made me think quite deeply. And I should say your point, about the institutional framework that is missing in the region, the fact that the transatlantic alliance has sort of neglected the region for too long at its own peril. I think these are points very, very well taken. In fact, personally, as a political scientist, I work from an institutionalist sort of school of thought. So I really couldn't agree more with you. However, and that's where I want to keep this discussion going and, provoke each other moving forward. I was wondering, you mentioned rightly the war that Russia has unleashed against Ukraine is actually linked to the region we are talking about here. But I was wondering, whilst listening to you talk about the institutional gap, is it not the case that institutionalized forms of cooperation, or of countries that have been part of institutionalized forms of cooperation, have failed to bring about the desired, if you like, political stability in the wider region? I have to go back to the example of Turkey here, a NATO ally since the 1950s, but clearly from a foreign policy point of view, and at least over the last decade, I don't want to go further back into time, adopting a stance which is not necessarily reflecting the way in which the rest of the NATO alliance has been thinking about alliance building in the region, including institutionalized forms of cooperation. So I guess what I'm saying is the idea behind institutionally tying the region closer together is, I think, one that hardly anyone could really disagree with. But the political feasibility of it, given the precedent that the Russian Federation has set to us since last year, in which you mentioned, in addition to foreign policy calculations that, allow me to say, go beyond the win-win scenario that you rightly described. I wonder if that makes our life harder in terms of tying the very different foreign policy orientations of the countries of the region together in a coherent package. And the last point I want to make, if I may, very briefly on this, I mentioned in my presentation that, in some of the regional forms of institutionalized cooperation that we have, the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, to my mind, is approximating a little bit what Ino seems to have in mind, right? Making sure that Turkey becomes a member of it and leaves aside some of its objections would be a perfect way to illustrate what we can do there. And then the more critically minded scholar in me says, well, hang on, it is actually a bit of a question mark why you have EU countries, Petro, which are not of the region, who are full members of the Gas Forum, and what their set of interests is and how it is being articulated within that Gas Forum. So I suppose what I'm saying is we have overlapping, multi-level games here being played out simultaneously, and that constitutes a big challenge for us going forward. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that.
There is another big challenge in the architecture I painted. There is another big challenge, which is between democracies and non-democracies. Because if you take the strategic approach, you say that, yes, we have to cooperate with countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries. Okay, not beacons of democracy. All right. Turkey is a special case, and I will come to Turkey in a moment. But here, indeed, there is a problem with what we called in the past Europeanization, Westernization process. Because as geopolitics are back, because of the Russian invasion, and because also China ambition, because don't forget that China has also ambition for this region and for Africa. So we have a dichotomy between democracies and non-democracies. So are we going to align only with democracies, or we are going to make some, compromises with non-democracies in order to have a more strategic approach in the region? As I said, coming from the Gulf to the Mediterranean, this is a key question. And also you are, of course, you are both very good scholars of international relations. You know very well that when the West raised the question of democracy, the failure was total. Look at Iraq, look at the Arab Spring, and so on. So maybe, we need some other, let's say, formulas to bridge this difference we have with these regimes. So coming to Turkey, Turkey is a key state in the region. I think in this panel, we all recognize it. And even if we didn't, the reality is that it is a key state. And our wishes should be that Turkey is a predictable, good ally and good neighbor to Greece and other countries bordering Turkey. Okay. It will be the outcome of the next election that will define how Turkey goes, which direction it takes. So we cannot anticipate today how things will evolve in Turkey. But I get the impression that Turkey's, let's say, flirt or love affair with Russia is not that beneficial, and Turkey having a role in all these schemes that I described, maybe it may be more promising for any Turkish leadership than a special relationship with Russia that will be defeated, even if this is not reflected in whatever agreement will be reached. But Russia will be weakened after the war. So I don't see how the Turkish foreign policy and military establishment will opt to ally with Russia rather than the broader, let's say, Western front that I have described, including Israel and other Arab countries.
If I may, humbly, just to add on to what Eno said regarding the Turkey-Russia relation, I think in recent years there's been a tendency to focus perhaps more on positive relations between Turkey and Russia than is necessary, referring to the S-400 missile systems, referring to ongoing trade currently between the two countries, referring to some energy deals. But I think we need to keep in mind that, when one digs beneath the surface, one realizes these are really, in the strongest sense of the term, marriages of convenience. And for every positive instance of relations between these two countries, one doesn't have to look very far to find a half a dozen cases where they're at odds with one another, whether it was in Nagorno-Karabakh, whether it's Russian annoyances at Bayraktar drones being used by Ukrainians or a number of other Turkish provisions, whether it's, I think, prospects for Turkey looking elsewhere to expand its energy infrastructure and so on. So I guess I'm just saying that to build off of what just said.
Yeah, I think there's a question there in the Q&A, and the question comes from one of the students. What are the challenges and opportunities for energy cooperation among Eastern Mediterranean countries in the development and exploration of resources? I think, Dimitris, you mentioned some. Maybe you can highlight some of them, or if Eno wants to go over some of that.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean this is really part of the argument I was trying to make earlier in the presentation in terms of the way in which those discoveries are both an opportunity and also at the same time a problem. And I say this, I want to emphasize that point a little bit because I'm not sure I made it as strongly as I should have done in the presentation itself. We are now going through a phase in which, following the pandemic and following the strategic decisions taken by the European Union to advance, no matter the cost, almost literally, both the digital transition and the green energy transition, to which Europe is committed to being a world champion. The idea of natural gas as a source of green energy is becoming increasingly domestically contested within the European Union. And the extent to which Europe is going to prioritize projects associated with hydrocarbons exploration is, in my mind, quite more doubtful today than it was at the time when the EastMed project was first launched, which was 4 years ago, or the time when the Gas Forum was inaugurated in 2020. So the challenge for me here is that this juncture that I see, on the one hand, on the geopolitical level, that Ino so nicely described for us earlier, which would make those explorations, particularly off the EEZ of Egypt and Israel, commercially and politically very important, right, for Europe to import that gas and be able to decouple from Russia once and for all. So that would be the opportunity side and so on, the geopolitical side. But then on the other, you have something that I don't think we should be undermining in this panel, which is Europe's absorption with itself and the absence of geopolitical thinking that goes on in Europe. And that absence, that emphasis on come what may the cost, making sure that there are going to be renewable energy resources that will fuel Europe's digital transition is becoming more and more an article of faith. So going back to Ino's point on the occasion of the question, can we really have these new forms of institutionalized cooperation when self-absorption has become the policy norm in Brussels? Allow me, Petro, to say very briefly, I'm advising postdoc and PhD students on some projects they're writing for a Brussels think tank, and the remit was CFSP, Common Foreign and Security Policy. Not one of the proposals that the major think tank with policy access in Europe has included, not one does not include China as a player for Europe going forward. And so I think this is a real issue in Europe that being outside of Europe, I get the chance to see a lot more visibly than before. So that disjuncture is a major challenge about what to do with those resources and how to upgrade the role that Europe can play. Potentially, there is a huge opportunity, but the challenge, I think, is also clear.
Look, there is another also issue that we have to put into the equation. We are discussing all these issues, having in mind that US will be present in the Mediterranean. For the time being, this is the case. But this is the challenge for Europe, in my view, because as Dimitris said about China, I mean, US at a certain moment, they will have to deal with China. So the Europeans will have to deal with their own affairs. And this is not what they are doing actually now. So this is a challenge for EU mostly, and NATO. NATO is also a European alliance, Euro-Atlantic, but with 28 out of 30 European member states. So it is up to Europeans to decide what to do with the broader area and the broader neighborhood.
Yeah, and I think, both of you raised a great point. We almost a year to the day of the invasion of Ukraine, and what was hoped to be a war of attrition or the sanctions would work. And we are seeing a year later that might not be in the way that we thought out, because our perception of the world does not fit the world that we live in today. That the balance of power has already moved and shifted de facto. So, if you look at even from American analysts, you're looking at the supply chain of armaments to Ukraine and to what extent the U.S. can keep up with this and with the supply requests that are being made, and how the war of attrition might be on this side of the Atlantic rather than on the other side of the Atlantic. The other thing about the sanctions, they haven't necessarily worked the way that we had planned, or U.S. policymakers had thought, or Europeans had thought, because there are alternatives to Russian energy and Russia resources. So actually, so this is, I think, those are both points to the points that you are both making this morning, as far as this changing environment altogether. And going back to Ino's point, as far as democracy is concerned, I think this is more like an American perception of democracy that has this sort of like, this messianic approach to democracy that we have seen completely fail in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 20 years. And maybe you need to sort of like, create more of a practical structure as far as processes where democracy and geopolitics find a modus vivendi moving forward as far as interests are concerned. And the last point that I will make is, like, living in the United States, and one factor that we don't necessarily speak of very much of is the level of tolerance of the American society and the American economy to go through this process, or what it requires to have a positive outcome from an American and European perspective when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're already seeing rifts here inside. We are approaching a very crucial presidential race in 2024. So I'm not quite sure that front stays as uniform as it has been the last year. And I think that's something else that we might see. Like, you might be seeing not only the possibility of a rise in China, or some kind of a sense in Russia that will never be, where we have seen in the last few years vis-a-vis their relations with Europe, whether it's defeated or not. I agree with that we're in a different kind of a landscape. But even the United States itself, I mean, going back to 2006 and limits of American power, and they're being tested right now again, some months after the post-Afghanistan. So I think that's also a factor that we have to consider, that the U.S. might not be as cohesive and as able to carry out this mission that it has undertaken very, very visibly. So I don't know if there are any, we have 3 minutes to wrap things up. So I don't know if there are any other comments or points. Dimitris, I saw you were ready to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to sort of stress the point that you made earlier, Petro, with regard to the transatlantic alliance, since our panel was dedicated to both the EU and NATO as the supremely important Western organizations. And I think it's important, as we bring this session to an end, maybe to tie it to, obviously, the war in Ukraine and what this has meant for the transatlantic alliance. Now, on the good side, let me start from this. We have seen, have we not, a solidification of the transatlantic alliance as a result of President Biden's leadership, and largely the ability of Europe to stand united. And I should say, having criticized Europe before, let me be very clear, as an EU scholar, let's not undermine the capacity of Europe to act when united and posing in a united front. I say this with reference to Brexit, and I say it with reference to the war in Ukraine. Let us not forget, it seems obvious now that President Putin's calculation was largely premised on the idea that Central Europe, and especially Germany's gas dependence on Russia, would lead at least to transatlantic disunity, something which has not materialized. So I'm saying this not to contradict what you said, Petro. In the future, I see the same trend, but it is important to acknowledge, I think, what we have managed to achieve. The last point I want to make has to do with democracy promotion, and I know that you are a scholar, Petro, that has worked so much on it, And I will provocatively say this at the end so that you can't have any time to answer really. And we'll need to take this out for a copy next time I'm in Boston or next time you're in DC. But let me just say, just to provoke maybe all of us sitting here, has the United States really invested in democracy promotion ever? Or has it invested, and that links with Ino's point, right, about the challenge we face in the Eastern Med, because obviously so many countries are not democracies. Has there really been any time over the last 200 years of diplomatic history an attempt by those countries that carry the flag of democracy to go out there and say, yes, we should have a really consistent, persistent, honest, and explicit attempt to reinforce democratic values in society? Obviously, I'm not talking about regime change. This is a brutal violation of international norms. I'm talking about real democracy promotion from the bottom up. In my humble opinion, not the United States, not Europe, no one ever has really attempted to allow the peoples of this region and indeed other regions of the world to enjoy the fruits of democracy. If that was ever to be made by some leadership, which I don't see coming forward, allow me to say, I would sign up. I just don't see it happening. So worth keeping in mind.
No, because as my last point, and thank you again, Petros, for this so passionate discussion that we had. We may continue, you know, in Athens, in Boston, whatever. You will be welcome. I mean, democracy worked by, let's say, a bad word, cooptation. I mean, EU and NATO membership helped Greece, let's say, to improve democracy, and other countries as well. So maybe by coming closer to countries that are non-democratic, maybe we will encourage the civil societies of these countries to fight for another way.
Well, I think I'm very intrigued by this this conversation, and I think it requires a whole panel, if not a whole entire seminar. I'm off to teach political theory, so I will keep this in absolute in mind. I would say to my both my friends and colleagues, and with great respect, that Dimitri, we're in this liberal democracy, so this liberal part has economic criteria tied into it. So, you know, maybe the answer lies in there somewhere.
Right.
I can't thank you enough for this very lively discussion this morning, and really setting the standard fairly high by both of you. I want to thank the attendees. I want to thank Isaac, and the partners in all of this, Edis and the American College of Greece, the Karamanlis Chair at the Fletcher School, for putting this seminar together. And we're moving on in about 45 minutes from now, less than 45 minutes, by turning our attention to the Balkans, a panel chaired by Ambassador Garcevic, and Isaac, of course, is going to be there. And then later this afternoon at 1 p.m. Boston time, 9 p.m. Kuwait time, Professor Yasmin Al-Hasnawi will be talking about Libya and that situation there. So a very full day. Get some rest, get some coffee. I thank everybody, and I will see you all later.